You may be standing in a place right now where everything looks uncertain. Maybe you've been asking, Lord, what's next for me? Where do I go from here? The path ahead may seem blurry, the road filled with obstacles, and the journey longer than you expected. But I came to remind you today, God knows exactly what's next for you. It's easy to feel stuck when life doesn't seem to be moving in the direction you expected. You may be looking at your current situation and wondering how it all fits into the bigger picture. The bills are piling up. The opportunities seem scarce. The doors you were counting on remain shut. And the prayers you have been whispering into the night seem to go unanswered. But what if I told you that what you see right now is not the full story? What if I told you that God is writing something far greater than you could ever imagine, and you are just in the middle of the process? God's plan is never confined to what you can see. Your perspective is limited, but His is infinite. While you are looking at the pieces, He sees the whole puzzle. While you are focusing on the struggle, He sees the victory ahead. You may feel like you're in a place of delay, but God is working in ways that you cannot yet perceive. What feels like a season of stagnation is often a season of preparation. The very things you see as obstacles might be the tools God is using to shape you for what's coming next. Think about Joseph in the Bible. He had a vision of greatness, a dream that set him apart. But before he could step into the fulfillment of that dream, he found himself betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and locked up in a prison cell. If Joseph had judged God's plan based on his current situation, he would have given up. He could have believed that his story ended in the pit, that his destiny was stolen in slavery, or that his purpose was locked away in that prison. But what Joseph didn't know was that every step of the journey, every hardship, every betrayal, every setback was positioning him for something far greater. Your life is no different. What you see right now is not where your story ends. The frustration, the disappointment, the unanswered questions, none of it is wasted. God is using it to mold you, to strengthen you, to refine your character, to teach you lessons that will be essential for the next level. You may feel like you're walking through a season of loss, but what if God is actually making room for something better? You may feel like doors are closing all around you, but what if those doors are shutting to redirect you to something beyond your imagination? The enemy wants you to believe that your current circumstances define your future. He wants you to think that what you're going through right now is all there is. But let me tell you something, God is not done. What He started in you, He will complete. What He promised you, He will fulfill. Your life is not a random series of events. It is a masterpiece being carefully crafted by the one who sees the end from the beginning. The struggles you are facing today are temporary. They are not permanent roadblocks, they are stepping stones. What seems like chaos is often divine order in disguise. What seems like failure is often a setup for something greater. God is not limited by your bank account, your past mistakes, your family background, or the opinions of people around you. He does not operate on human timelines. He is not bound by your expectations. His plan is sovereign, and nothing can stop what He has ordained. So don't allow the weight of your current situation to make you doubt the greatness of what's ahead. What you see now is not the final chapter. The pain is not the end of the story. The struggle is not the conclusion. There is more, and it is coming. Even when you don't understand, even when it feels like nothing is moving, God is still in control. He is still leading, still directing, still working. And when the time is right, everything will fall into place, just as He intended. One of the hardest things in life is delays are not waiting for the breakthrough, waiting for the opportunity, waiting for the answer to that prayer, waiting for the moment when everything finally comes together. The waiting season can feel like an eternity, and if you're not careful, it will make you question whether God has forgotten about you. It will make you wonder if what you've been hoping for will ever come to pass. But let me tell you something, just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it won't happen. Just because the door hasn't opened doesn't mean it's locked. Just because the promise hasn't manifested doesn't mean God changed his mind. A delay is not a denial. Look at the story of Abraham. God told him that he would be the father of many nations, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars. But year after year went by and nothing changed. His wife Sarah was barren. Their situation looked impossible. From a human perspective, the promise seemed like it would never happen. But God is not bound by human limitations. When the time was right, he fulfilled his word. Sarah gave birth to Isaac, and the promise became reality. The years of waiting weren't wasted, they were part of the process. Many of you are in that waiting season right now. You've prayed, you've fasted, you've done everything you know to do, and still, it seems like nothing is moving. But God is not ignoring you. He is not turning a deaf ear to your cries. He sees you. He hears you. He knows the desires of your heart. The delay is not to frustrate you. It is to prepare you. If God gave you everything you wanted the moment you asked for it, you wouldn't be ready to handle it. There are things he still needs to develop in you. Lessons he needs to teach you. Character he needs to refine in you before he releases the blessing. Think about David. He was anointed to be king as a young man, but he didn't step into that role immediately. Instead, he spent years tending sheep, fighting battles, and running from Saul. It would have been easy for David to question the delay, to wonder why he wasn't already sitting on the throne. But in those years of waiting, God was preparing him. He was teaching him how to lead, how to fight, how to trust in him. By the time David finally became king, he was ready for it. The process had shaped him into the man who could handle the position. Your process is doing the same for you. The delays you're experiencing are not punishments, they are training grounds. God is developing endurance in you, faith in you, patience in you. He is removing things that would hinder you, aligning the right people and opportunities, and making sure that when you step into what he has for you, you don't just enter it, you thrive in it. The enemy will try to use the waiting season to make you give up. He will whisper lies, telling you that if it hasn't happened by now, it never will. He will try to convince you that God has forgotten about you, that your dreams were never meant to come true. But the devil is a liar. Just because you don't see movement doesn't mean God isn't working. Just because it looks like nothing is changing doesn't mean things aren't shifting behind the scenes. Sometimes the reason for the delay is because God is protecting you. There are doors you wanted to walk through that would have destroyed you. There are relationships you wanted to hold on to that would have pulled you away from your purpose. There are jobs you thought were for you that would have drained your spirit. And because God loves you too much to let you settle for less than what he has planned, he allowed the delay. You may not understand it now, but one day you will look back and thank him for not giving you what you wanted when you wanted it. One of the most difficult experiences in life is feeling like God is silent. You pray and there's no answer. You seek direction and there's no clarity. You pour out your heart, but it seems like heaven is quiet. And in those moments, the enemy will try to make you believe that because God is silent, he is absent. That because you don't hear him, he has left you. But let me tell you something, just because you can't hear him doesn't mean he isn't there. Just because he isn't speaking doesn't mean he isn't working. Some of the greatest moves of God happen in silence. Some of the most powerful breakthroughs begin when it looks like nothing is happening. Think about Jesus on the cross. When he hung there, suffering and abandoned, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In that moment, it looked like heaven was silent. It looked like God had turned away. But in that very silence, the greatest miracle in human history was unfolding. Salvation was being secured. The grave was being defeated. Death was being conquered. The silence wasn't abandonment, it was preparation for resurrection. Many of you are in a place right now where you don't understand what God is doing. You've been faithful, you've obeyed, and yet it feels like he's not responding. You're asking questions, but the answers aren't coming. You're looking for signs, but you don't see them. And if you're not careful, the silence will make you doubt what he has already spoken. It will make you question whether you really heard him in the first place. But hear me, God is not a man that he should lie. If he spoke it, he will do it. If he promised it, he will fulfill it. The silence is not a sign that he has changed his mind. It is not a signal that he has forgotten you. Sometimes God is silent because he is testing your faith. Will you trust him when you can't trace him? Will you hold on to his word when you don't feel his presence? Will you keep walking in obedience even when you don't hear his voice? Look at Job. He was a man who honored God, a man of integrity, a man who walked in righteousness. Yet in one moment, his entire world was turned upside down. He lost his children, his wealth, his health. His friends questioned him. His wife told him to curse God and die. And through it all, God was silent. Job couldn't understand it. He cried out for answers, but no response came. He searched for God in his pain, but it seemed like heaven was closed. But just because God wasn't speaking didn't mean he wasn't watching. Just because Job couldn't hear him didn't mean he wasn't near. God's silence is often a setup for revelation. Sometimes he isn't speaking because he has already given you the instruction, and he's waiting to see if you will trust him in the quiet. A teacher doesn't talk during the test. When the exam is placed in front of the student, the teacher steps back. Not because they are absent, but because they want to see if the student has learned what has been taught. Some of you are in a testing season. You've been given the lessons, you've been prepared, and now God is watching to see if you will stand in faith, even when you don't feel his hand. Think about Lazarus. When he was sick, his sister sent word to Jesus, expecting him to come immediately. But Jesus didn't rush. He waited. He delayed. And in that silence, Lazarus died. Can you imagine the pain of Mary and Martha? Can you imagine their confusion? They had faith that Jesus could heal their brother, yet he didn't come. He didn't send a word. He didn't do anything, at least, not that they could see. But what they didn't know was that Jesus wasn't ignoring them. He wasn't absent. He was waiting for the right time to move. And when he finally arrived, he didn't just heal Lazarus, he resurrected him. Some of you are frustrated because you feel like God is late. You expected him to show up by now. You thought the breakthrough would have come already. You believed the answer would have arrived. But let me remind you, God is never late. He is never behind schedule. His silence is not an indication of his inactivity. Sometimes he delays because what he is about to do is bigger than what you asked for. Sometimes he allows things to die so that when he resurrects them, there will be no doubt that it was him. In the silence, God is strengthening your faith. In the quiet, he is refining your trust. He is teaching you to rely on his word, not just on his voice. He is teaching you to hold on to his promises, even when there's no visible evidence. He is molding your character, shaping your patience, and positioning you for something greater. God's silence is not his absence. His delay is not his denial. His quietness is not rejection. Even when you don't hear him, he is near. Even when you can't see him, he is working. Even when it feels like nothing is happening, everything is happening according to his perfect will. There is nothing more frustrating than a door slamming shut in your face. You put in the effort, you make the sacrifices, you do everything right, and just when you think you're about to step into your breakthrough, the door closes. The opportunity disappears. The relationship falls apart. The job you were counting on doesn't come through. The plan you had so carefully crafted suddenly crumbles. And in those moments, it's easy to feel discouraged. It's easy to feel abandoned. It's easy to wonder, God, why would you let this happen? Why would you bring me this far just to close the door in my face? But let me tell you something, God doesn't close doors to punish you. He closes them to protect you. He shuts doors not to hinder you, but to position you for something greater. Every closed door is a setup for a better opportunity, a greater blessing, a higher calling. What you see as rejection is often divine redirection. What you think is a setback is really a setup. God doesn't just move through open doors, he moves through the ones he shuts. Look at Joseph. He had a dream, a vision of greatness, a promise from God that he would be in a position of power. But what happened? Instead of rising to the top immediately, every door seemed to shut. His own brothers betrayed him. The door to his family closed. He was thrown into a pit. The door to his freedom closed. He was sold into slavery. The door to his comfort closed. He was falsely accused and thrown into prison. The door to his reputation closed. But what Joseph didn't realize was that every closed door was leading him closer to the palace. Every rejection was a step toward his destiny. Every no was a part of God's plan to get him to his yes. Some of you are crying over doors that God intentionally closed. You're mourning over relationships that God removed. You're frustrated about opportunities that slipped through your fingers. But what if I told you that the very thing you're crying about is the thing God is using to bless you? What if the job that rejected you was actually keeping you from being stuck in the wrong place? What if the relationship that ended was God's way of freeing you for something better? What if the delay you're experiencing is actually God's divine protection? See, we have a limited perspective. We only see what's in front of us, but God sees the whole picture. We think that when a door closes, we've lost something. But in reality, God is positioning us for something we never even imagined. Sometimes, He has to remove good things to make room for great things. Sometimes, He has to block what you wanted to give you what you need. Think about Ruth. She lost her husband. The door to her old life closed. She had every reason to go back home, to return to what was familiar. But instead, she followed Naomi to a place she had never been before. And because she refused to go backward, because she trusted God even when she didn't understand, she walked straight into her destiny. She met Boaz. She stepped into a divine opportunity. And what she thought was the end of her story was actually the beginning of something greater. Some of you are trying to reopen doors that God has already locked. You're trying to revive something that God has already buried. You're standing in front of a closed door, banging on it, begging for it to open when God is saying, if you only knew what's on the other side, you would stop looking back and start moving forward. When one door closes, don't waste time trying to pry it open. Don't beg for something that God has already decided is not for you. If He closed it, it means He has something better. If He removed it, it means He is making room for something greater. The problem is, we don't like the waiting season. We don't like uncertainty. We want God to open the next door immediately. But sometimes there's a gap between what was and what will be. Sometimes God closes a door and then waits. And in that waiting, He is testing your faith. Will you trust Him when you don't see the next step? Will you believe in His plan, even when you don't have all the details? Look at the Israelites. When they left Egypt, they expected to walk straight into the promised land. But instead, God led them through the wilderness. The door to Egypt was closed, but the door to Canaan wasn't open yet. And in that in-between season, they had a choice: trust God or turn back. Some of them complained. Some of them doubted. Some of them wanted to return to slavery because at least it was familiar. And that's the danger of not trusting God's closed doors. When you don't believe that something better is ahead, you'll settle for what's behind you. Don't settle for Egypt when God is leading you to Canaan. Don't go back to what's familiar just because the future is uncertain. The same God who closed the door is the same God who will open the right one at the right time. The same God who removed you from that place is the same God who will plant you where you're meant to be. God never closes a door without having another one prepared. It may not open on your timeline. It may not look like what you expected. It may not happen the way you planned. But when it does open, you'll realize why the last one had to close. You'll understand why He said no. You'll see why the rejection was necessary. Because what's ahead of you is so much greater than what's behind you. One of the hardest things in life is waiting. Waiting for an answer. Waiting for a breakthrough. Waiting for a promise to be fulfilled. And if we're honest, waiting can feel like denial. It can feel like God is ignoring us, like He's forgotten about us, like He's answering everyone else's prayers while ours sit on the shelf collecting dust. And in those moments of delay, doubt starts creeping in. Did I miss something? Did I pray wrong? Did I do something that made God change His mind? But let me tell you something, just because God hasn't done it yet doesn't mean He's not going to do it. Just because it hasn't happened in your timing doesn't mean it's not happening in His. God's delays are not denials. His silence is not absence. His timing is perfect. And if He's making you wait, it's because He's preparing something greater than what you imagined. Think about Abraham. God gave him a promise that he would be the father of many nations. But the problem was, years passed, and nothing happened. He and Sarah were getting older. Their bodies were past the age of childbearing, and I can imagine Abraham waking up some mornings, looking at Sarah, and thinking, did I hear God right? Did I misunderstand Him? Because when you've been waiting for something for so long, it's easy to start questioning what you once believed. And that's what some of you are facing right now. You started with faith. You started believing. But because the answer didn't come when you expected, because the door didn't open immediately, you started second-guessing. You started doubting. You started losing hope. But let me remind you of something: just because it looks delayed doesn't mean it's denied. Just because it hasn't shown up yet doesn't mean God isn't working behind the scenes. Look at Joseph. He had a dream that he would be in a position of leadership, but instead of stepping into his promise immediately, he found himself in a pit, then a prison. Everything seemed to be going in the opposite direction of what God said. But what Joseph didn't realize was that every delay was preparing him for his destiny. If he had gone straight from the dream to the palace, he wouldn't have been ready. He needed the process. He needed the waiting season. He needed time for God to refine him, mature him, and position him so that when the door finally opened, he was ready to walk through it. That's why you can't despise the waiting season. You can't despise the delays. Because sometimes what feels like a setback is actually a setup. Sometimes what seems like God holding out on you is actually God holding on to you, keeping you in place until the perfect moment arrives. Look at David. He was anointed king as a teenager, but he didn't take the throne immediately. Instead, he spent years running from Saul, hiding in caves, fighting battles that seemed unrelated to his purpose. And I can imagine him asking God, if you called me to be king, why am I out here running for my life? Why does it feel like I'm going backward instead of forward? But what David didn't see was that every battle he fought in the wilderness was preparing him for the battles he would face in the palace. Every delay was building his character, strengthening his faith, teaching him how to lead, so that when the time came, he wasn't just a man with a crown, he was a man with wisdom, with patience, with experience. Some of you are frustrated because you feel stuck in a season of waiting. You've prayed, you've fasted, you've done everything you know to do, but the answer hasn't come. And you're wondering, God, why? But what if I told you that the delay is not a punishment, it's preparation? What if the very thing you're frustrated about is the thing God is using to strengthen you? What if the waiting is the training ground for the next level? See, we live in a world that wants everything instantly. We want microwave blessings. We want drive-through breakthroughs. We want God to move on our schedule. But God doesn't operate on our timeline. He operates on His. And sometimes, His best work happens in the waiting. Sometimes, the greatest miracles are birthed in seasons of delay. Look at Lazarus. When he got sick, his sister sent word to Jesus, expecting him to come immediately. But instead of rushing to their aid, Jesus waited. He delayed his arrival. And by the time he got there, Lazarus was already dead. People questioned him. They said, Lord, If you had been here, he wouldn't have died. But Jesus knew something they didn't. He wasn't late. He was right on time. Because he didn't come to heal Lazarus, he came to resurrect him. What looked like a delay was actually a setup for a greater miracle. And that's what some of you need to understand. You think God is late. You think he forgot. You think it's over. But he's not late. He's setting you up for something greater. He's not ignoring you. He's preparing you. Because sometimes he doesn't just want to answer your prayer. He wants to exceed your expectation. He doesn't just want to open the door. You need to be ready to walk through it. So don't give up just because it hasn't happened yet. Don't let frustration make you walk away from your promise. Don't let impatience make you settle for less than what God has for you. If he said it, he will do it. If he promised it, he will bring it to pass. It may not be when you want, it may not be how you expect, but it will be exactly what you need at exactly the right time. Life has a way of making us feel lost. When plans fall apart, when relationships break, when opportunities slip through our fingers, we start wondering if we've missed our moment, if we've messed up too badly, if we've missed a dead end. But I want to remind you today, God has already written your next chapter. What looks like the end to you is just the turning of a page in his divine script. What feels like uncertainty to you is a story that God has already authored. See, we get caught up in what we see. We focus on the moment we're in. We analyze our failures, replay our disappointments, and question whether there's anything good left for us. But what if I told you that your next season has already been decided? What if I told you that before you ever got to this place, God had already mapped out the next move? You may not see it yet. You may not understand how it's going to happen. But God is not figuring things out as he goes. He already knows what's next for you. Look at Job. He had everything: wealth, health, a family, a home, and in a moment, it was all gone. His body was covered in boils. His friends turned on him. His wife told him to curse God and die. If anyone had a reason to believe that his story was over, it was Job. But what Job didn't know was that God had already written the next chapter. What looked like the end was just a transition. What felt like complete destruction was actually a setup for restoration. Because when Job got through the test, when he refused to let his circumstances define his faith, God gave him double for his trouble. Twice the wealth, twice the favor, twice the blessing. But here's the thing: it wasn't something God decided after Job suffered. It was something God had already written before the trial even started. And that's what you need to understand about your own life. You may be walking through a season of loss, a season of confusion, a season of frustration. But God is not improvising. He is not scrambling to fix what you see as broken. Your future is not uncertain to him. Your next move is not unknown to him. Before you ever cried a tear, before you ever faced a setback, before you ever felt like giving up, God already had a plan in place. Think about Moses. When he fled Egypt, when he ended up in the wilderness tending sheep, he probably thought his life had taken a wrong turn. He probably assumed that whatever purpose he once had was gone. But what he didn't know was that his next chapter was already written. God had already planned his burning bush encounter. God had already set up his assignment. And when the time was right, God called him forward not to rewrite his story, but to step into the chapter that had been prepared for him all along. That's why you can't let temporary situations convince you that you're stuck. You can't let delays make you think you've been forgotten. Just because you can't see what's next doesn't mean God hasn't already planned it. Just because you don't have all the answers doesn't mean he's not in control. Every twist in your journey, every setback, every closed door, it's all part of a bigger plan. Look at Ruth. She lost her husband, left her homeland, and found herself in a foreign place with no security, no direction, no idea of what was next. But what she didn't know was that her next chapter was already written. God had already positioned Boaz. God had already orchestrated her steps. What looked like a painful ending was actually the setup for a divine connection that would place her in the lineage of Jesus. And some of you are in that in-between place right now. You don't know what's coming next. You don't see how things are going to work out, and the enemy wants you to believe that this is the end. He wants you to believe that your best days are behind you. He wants you to believe that you've run out of options. But I came to tell you God is not finished. Your story is still being revealed. There are doors you haven't walked through yet. There are blessings you haven't seen yet. There are breakthroughs you haven't experienced yet. See, we want to know every detail before we trust God. We want to see the full picture before we take the next step. But faith doesn't work that way. Faith says, I trust the author even when I don't understand the chapter. Faith says, I believe that if God brought me this far, He already knows how to take me further. And let me tell you something, God doesn't write incomplete stories. He doesn't abandon what He starts. If He has spoken a word over your life, it will come to pass. If He has given you a vision, He will bring it to completion. It may not happen the way you expected. It may not unfold in the timing you wanted. But if God wrote it, it will happen. If He promised it, it will come to pass. Look at Peter. He was just a fisherman when Jesus called him. He had no idea that his next chapter would involve walking on water, preaching to multitudes, and becoming the foundation of the early church. When he denied Jesus 3 times, when he felt like a failure, when he thought his story was over, Jesus still had a plan for him. Because his failure wasn't the final word, God had already written his redemption. And that's what I need you to understand. You may have made mistakes. You may have taken wrong turns. You may have been through pain you never expected. But your past does not cancel your future. Your detours do not erase your destiny. Your failures do not disqualify you from what God has planned. Because God doesn't just see where you are, He sees where you're going. He doesn't just know your struggle, He knows that struggle. So don't let fear stop you from moving forward. Don't let doubt keep you from believing. Don't let uncertainty make you settle. The same God who brought you through past seasons is the same God who has already written your next chapter. You may not see it yet, you may not understand it, but trust and believe it is already done. You may not know what's next, but God does. You may feel uncertain, but He is not. Your story is not being written in real time. God has already finished the script. Every setback, every challenge, every moment of waiting is leading you to what He has already prepared. So don't let fear paralyze you. Don't let disappointment make you doubt. Don't let the unknown make you question the one who holds the future. If He brought you this far, He will not leave you now. If He spoke a promise over your life, it will come to pass. Your next chapter has already been written, and when the time is right, God will turn the page. Walk in faith, hold on to His word, and trust that what He has planned is greater than anything you could ever imagine.